Here we'll be talking about really the Muslim experience in Central Asia, South Asia, going through South Asia. I mean, we are biting more than we can chew because of time. Now, you cannot understand Islam in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia without taking into account Baghdad, Iraq, and how Iraq served as a gateway for the Muslim armies, because since the Battle of Hadisiyah, in which the Persians were defeated by the Muslim armies, Muslim armies, and of course Saddam Hussein, unfortunately, tried to use that as an occasion of Arab nationalism, when in actual fact, really, it was Muslim success, because those Arabs were Arabs, ethnically Arabs, but they didn't see themselves as Arabs defeating Persians. They were doing it fi sabilillah. They were fighting as Muslims. Again, that's very important concepts. They didn't have this Arab nationalism that developed in the 19th, 20th century. They were going out there as Muslims, because the very people they were fighting in Makkah were Arabs, like them. So they were not fighting because they were Arabs. They were fighting because they were Muslims. So when the Iraqi Muslims, together with the other Arabs from Yemen and other places in Arabia, went to Persia and they defeated the Persians, those Persians were fighting not as Persians. They were fighting as defenders of the Sassanid Empire, which was built on Zoroastrianism. So you had the battle of two religions, Islam, the emerging young religion, and Zoroastrianism, the long-established religion of the Persian people and neighboring peoples who embraced that religion. Now, that's the background against which we can understand the spread of Islam. As the Muslim armies move into Iraq, and then they push into what we now call Persia, you see gradually Islam moving into what we now call Afghanistan. Because through the Khyber Pass, Islam will now come into what we now call Pakistan and India. Because the Indian Muslims, of course, you know that Pakistan is a recent creation. You know that. I mean, some Pakistanis don't like to hear that, but Pakistan is a recent creation. I mean, you know, like places we call Pakistan are provinces of the old British Empire, which was part of the Mughal Empire. I mean, the British defeated the Mughals and took over the land and created their own British India. Now, when the Muslims came in, there was no Pakistan. There was Hindustan, land of the Indians, that was known to the Arabs, even before Islam. And there are Indian words, Hindi, or now we call Urdu words, even in the Qur'an itself. So, I mean, you know, like you have the Arabs had knowledge, geographic knowledge of India before Islam. So when the Muslim armies move in to Afghanistan, and those Arab armies that came in, of course, were able to establish Islamic presence in these areas where Zoroastrianism, the Nestorian Christianity existed. And then the Muslims now gradually move into Hindu-Buddhist territory, India and portion of Central Asia, where Buddhism has spread into China. So Islam now began to compete with Nestorianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Maniism, and Zoroastrianism. So you have this rich religious landscape into which Islam was moving in. So people we now call Pushtun, or many of us now, because of British influence, call them Pathans. Even South Asians themselves call these people Pathans, because the British conditioned them, they say Pathans. But the people who are called Pathans in the literature don't like to call themselves Pathans. That's the name from outside. They call themselves Pushtun. Now, these people from the northwest frontier province of British India, now Pakistan, and then Afghanistan, now celebrate the fact that they celebrate the exploits of people like Khalid bin Walid, who was a major Muslim warrior. Khalid is named after that warrior there. His namesake, Khalid bin Walid. So, I mean, these Muslim armies that came across the borders of Iran and Afghanistan would, of course, cross through this Khyber Pass into India. And of course, this would give rise to the planting of Islam in northern India. And today you find the people who live in Pakistan and India who are Muslims can trace their roots to some of those soldiers who came from the Muslim armies. And you have major centers of learning, just like in West Africa, as we were talking about. You have towns that were created by Hindus many years ago, but you have new towns that were created by these Muslim armies and traders. Mansuria, Lucknow, and many others that you find in northern part of India. Now, this becomes very important in terms of the development of Islam in that part of the world. Now, of course, the Islam that came into the area would be the Islam that came overland. Just like in Africa again, Islam did not only come across the Sahara in the case of Africa, but Islam came across the Khyber Pass into northern. But then Islam also came by boat to India, because you have those Arabs who were traveling. Long before Islam, Arabs were traveling by boats along the quote-unquote Persian or Arabian Gulf. It's controversial. Some Arabs don't like the word Persian Gulf. So some of us call it the Islamic Gulf. So, I mean, like this way, in that region called the Persian Gulf, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Bahrain, and all that area, these people you have Arab tribes living in that region. And of course, many of them were involved in pearl fishing, trying to get pearls in that part of the world. Many of them were nomadic peoples. But with Islam, and even before Islam, the Greeks and the Romans knew the area. So, and the Persians, the Iranians, civilization, the Sassanid. Now, Arab traders traveled by boat to India. And of course, in that way, you had connections. The same thing will happen in the case of Indonesia and China. Those Arab traders will go to those parts of the world. Now, the point I want to make with regard to India is that Indian civilization is very old, thousands of years. And of course, when the Muslims came into the area, other civilizations and cultures have also visited that area. I mean, they didn't stay long, but they came in. People like Alexander the Great is well known. They came into the area, northern India, not southern India, northern India. So when the Muslims came into the area, they started from northern India. And of course, Muslim power did not spread to the whole subcontinent of India. It was basically a northern experience. And of course, there were Muslims who moved south. But if you look at today, even in India today, you'll find that the majority of the Muslims are concentrated in certain geographic zones. And this is likely because of the pattern of penetration of Islam in that part of the world. And of course, you have a history of military forces. In this case, Muslim armies came, and they did conquer. But you have a big role for Muslim scholars and Muslim merchants, because they were into the spice trade. And the spice trade and all the other goodies that came out of India went west, because India became a very important thoroughfare in that trade between the east and the west, north and the south. And of course, Indian knowledge was also transmitted to West Asia, not only in the field of medicine, astronomy, but in mathematics. And that's one of the reasons why today we borrow from the Indians what is called the Arabic zero. It came from India, but it was popularized in the West by the Muslims. So it's now identified as the Arabic numerals. because the Arabic numerals carried to the West the concept of a zero. We wouldn't have computers today if that civilizational knowledge was not borrowed from the Arabs by way of the Indians. You see, so that is the part of the knowledge transfer that took place as a result of this dialogue between the Islamic civilization on the one hand and the Hindu civilization in India on the other. Now, of course, as in Africa, as in other parts of the world where Islam went, cities and towns emerge and you begin to have dynasties, one coming in only to be replaced by others. The same kind of sectarianism, Sunnis versus Shiites, also played out. And even within the Shiite groups, you will have subdivisions between these different groups, to the point that you have Ismaili groups developing also. So the expansion of these doctrinal groups that started in West Asia, in Iraq, in Syria, being played out in Afghanistan and in the Indian subcontinent. And today, if you look at the geography of religion in India and Pakistan, you will see that historically, all the factions that existed in the Muslim world of the Mediterranean have their representatives and their partisans in India. And this is true not only in terms of the Shiite-Sunni divide, which is very pronounced in that part of the world, more so than in sub-Saharan Africa, but it is also evident in terms of the Sufi tradition. And of course, as I said to you, what Hampateba said with regard to Islam in Africa, using the metaphor of the river, the bed of the river influencing the water, the same thing happened in India, because many of the practices that existed pre-Islam carry over into the new religion. And of course, just like in North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa, you have saint veneration among the Sufis. Some of these groups in India have big tombs for the saints, the awliya, who are the heads of these various Sufi groups. The other point that needs to be borne in mind is the fact that competition between the various dynasties existing contemporaneously or intergenerationally also affected Islam in the subcontinent. This was played out between the Umayyad and the Abbasid. It was also played out in the ruling dynasties that came into being in India, to the point that one of the dynasties would build the Taj Mahal, for example, to the point that it becomes a legacy of that dynasty. And then, of course, you have another set of rulers who will be instrumental in the planting of the seeds for the emergence of what we now call Urdu as a language. Because Urdu and Hindi, which is the language of the non-Muslim Indian, have many words in common, virtually the same language, but they have different words that reflect their religious consciousness. Because those who are Muslims use certain kind of words, which the others, by virtue of their Hinduism, will not use. I mean, I guess this, you find to some extent something like this in Arabic between the Christian Arabs and the Muslim Arabs. I mean, for example, among the Christian Arabs, they will never name their son Muhammad. You will never see a Christian Arab called Muhammad, but you will have Christian Arabs whose names are Ismail, Isa, Ibrahim, Abdullah, even Abdullah, they may call their kids, Abdullah, but like they will not call them Muhammad, you see. So you can see that these are some of the subtleties that exist in terms of cultures and civilization. And this happened also in India with regard to the coming of the Turkish, Persian, Arab influence in Indian culture. And those people who previously were Hindus became Muslim. Now, one interesting development with regard to Islam in South Asia, which you don't have in Africa, is because Islam confronted caste system in India. In the case of Africa, it was the tribalism of the Africans, and how Islam tried to create an overarching loyalty for these different tribal groups. In the case of India, people have to now evolve Islamically to accept a non-caste society. And of course, just like in Africa, where many of the Africans struggle and are still struggling to transcend their tribalism, in the case of India, many Muslims have and had and continue to struggle to transcend caste, because that was part of the old order before Islam. And of course, this led to the leveling of these societies. The coming of Islam led to the leveling of these societies, because the majority of the people who became Muslim in India and now Pakistan or Bangladesh came out of a Hindu background. Of course, a very small minority came out of a Buddhist background, because Buddhism came out of India, but it didn't have a foothold in India. In fact, Buddhism became more successful. This is one thing Christianity and Buddhism have in common. They are the only two world religions, the birthplace of whose founding father they don't control. So I mean, this is one thing that Buddha was an Indian, but he's more influential now among Chinese and other Asian groups than Indians. You see what I'm saying? Just like Christ. If you go to the Middle East, they are more Jewish and Muslim. Christians are very small in number now in the birthplace of Jesus. So that is one thing Buddha and Christ have in common, in the sense that the people, they have followers outside of their people. The people who should have been following Christ would be Arabs and Jews, because they are Semites, but they are not. It's the same thing with the Buddhists. The Buddhists are not Indians. There are very few Indians who are Buddhists. You see what I'm saying? These are things we don't want to talk about. These are realities that exist in world history. People don't want to deal with these realities, but this is history. So so when you look at reality in India, you will see that the coming of Islam in India changed the psychology of the Indian Muslims. That's one reason why Indian Muslims, even though they are a minority, they have a superiority complex vis-a-vis the Hindus. No, they do. They will not admit that, but they do. She admits that. It's why they don't want to admit. You see, it is human nature. The Muslim Indians, they are very small compared to these Hindu, but they still feel superior to them. Hey, you guys, who are you guys? So, that's the psychology, you see, that exists. Because Islam created that feeling in them that we received the last telephone number from God. You see what I'm saying? Because that's what Islam is. Jokingly, I always tell people that they play this supersessionist game. That's what we call theologically, we call it supersessionism. One religion claims to be superior to the other because of the recency of its message. We received the message more recently. Americans know that because they change their numbers in their lifetime. So their best friends are the ones who have their telephone numbers. So jokingly, when we go to interfaith dialogue, I always tell people that when we play the supersessionist game on each other, we are really playing a game I call the AT&T game. Because you see, if you claim that God gave you an 800 number, you just 1-800 Judaism, you get through. Now when you come and tell me you guys have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament, you're telling me that you have the latest number. So, so you're telling me that if I dial my old number, which worked for me all these years, by your logic, you are saying the angels are going to say the number you're dialing is not in service. Check the New Testament or the Qur'an for the latest. That happened in India with the Muslims. Because those Muslims, who now live in Pakistan, India, the Africans play the same game with their own tribal Africans who are not Muslims, that we got the latest message from God, because that's the Qur'an. And of course, that creates a sense of superiority. And of course, that works in the psychology, because you feel, hey, yeah, we received the latest message from God. And of course, this message is egalitarian. It centers on justice. And it affects the history of Islam in India. And it affects the consciousness of Muslims in India and other parts of South Asia. Now, the other point that needs to be borne in mind is the fact that the Sufi orders I'm talking about that came into the area, came from different areas. So you have the Qadiriya, Zadziliya, you have the Naqshbandi, and all these different groups. I mean, people like Trimingham and others, I mean, have listed all these different Sufi orders around the Muslim world. And of course, you find parallels. Some of them that exist in Africa have their counterparts or their sister organizations in India. So the Qadiris in one part of the world have their counterparts in India. And you find many of those groups that existed in the Arab world also existed in, and then you have new ones that were created in the subcontinent that may not have counterparts, like the Sistia, they may not have counterparts in the Arab world or some other parts of the Muslim world. Now, these different Sufi groups address certain realities. And of course, many of these Sufi groups were exposed to an environment where you have a long tradition of Hindu thought. And of course, just like in Africa, you find that Islamic theology challenged the old mythology or the old theology in the case of North Africa, because the North African Berbers were exposed to various forms of Christianity and Judaism. So with the coming of Islam, a new paradigm was presented to them. In sub-Saharan Africa, a monotheistic philosophy was now challenging a mythical philosophy, what the anthropologists will call worldviews, primal worldviews. In the case of India, you have a long tradition of philosophy and cosmologies developed by Hindus. You have various schools of philosophies among the Hindus. With the coming of Islam, those philosophical systems were now being challenged by an Islamic world order or worldview. And of course, because the Muslims came with power and were able to establish themselves, the Islamic worldview gradually dominated. What is very interesting is that the Muslims did not force the Indians to become Muslims, to the point that the non-Muslims, and there was some adjustment, because some of the Muslim scholars who came into India, and the first Muslim scholar who did a thorough study of India was Al-Biruni. And of course, what transpired at this time was that Muslims were now beginning to have a geographic knowledge, an ethnographic knowledge of these people they are now conquering or ruling in India. And of course, with that kind of knowledge, the Muslims were now beginning to deal with the Indians. Unfortunately, the Muslims did not follow the example of Al-Biruni to the point that they began now to go into deeper understanding of the culture. And this is likely because the Muslims just dismissed them as people who have distorted whatever original message was given to them. The whole field of Orientalism that we now identify with the West, you see, did not develop at that time. There is nothing called Islamic Orientalism. Muslims looking at Indian culture the way, post-Enlightenment Westerners went to other parts of the world and were looking at those societies through the lenses and filters of Western culture. Al-Biruni went in there to look at the Indians, and he did write about the Indians and explain how they look at reality in light of this personal experience of what was happening at that time. The point I'm making here really is that when you look at the coming of the Muslims were not only coming as invaders or conquerors, they had to also engage in cultural transfer, on cultural transaction with the people over there. It was not a one-way traffic, because there was exchange, as I just illustrated with the borrowing of the zero, which was passed on later to the West and to the rest of the world, and is now part of the collective inheritance of humankind. But there were also points of convergence and points of divergence in this transaction flow. Now, Islam would change the geography of India permanently. Islam did not Arabize Indians, but it certainly changed those Muslims in India in a fundamental way. First of all, they no longer see themselves as Hindus. They see themselves as Muslims. And this is now the root cause of the tension between the Muslims and the Hindus in the area. Even people from the same ethnic group are polarized along religious lines. And certainly an Indian Muslim is much closer to an Arab Muslim than to a Hindu from his own ethnic group, theologically speaking, and sometimes even behaviorally and psychologically. You have the same phenomena in Africa and in Malaysia and some other places. Now, that doesn't mean to say cultural affinities do not exist between these groups. They exist. They can talk in the same language and they can interact with each other, but they are self-consciously light years apart from each other theologically because they look at reality very differently. Now, as a result of this, the alphabet changes. You no longer use Sanskrit or any of the script that existed before Islam. You now use modified script, just like in Africa I explained that the Africans had certain sounds. The same thing happened in the Indian subcontinent. They have specific sounds in their languages and they modify the Arabic script. And this becomes very evident in Urdu, which became the language of integration among the Muslims in that part of the world. Although these people who speak Urdu as the way European educated spoke Latin in the Middle Ages, I mean, you have their respective ethnic languages, and those respective ethnic languages have been communicated over the centuries through the medium of the modified Arabic script. So that's one impact that Arab influence had in Africa and in South Asia. It will have the same in Central Asia and China and Malaysia when I come to that. The other point I want to make is the whole vocabulary, the whole conceptual system of the Indian Muslims changed. They had new concepts to the point that when they speak Urdu, if you are an Arab or an African Muslim from the East African coast or from the Wall of Wall, you have words, just like when I was talking about the Swahili, when they say Malaika, if you're from India, you say Malaika, hey, we have the same word. And you know, like when they talk about Wazir, you can see. So in the Western context, just like Latin gave a number of loan words to many of these European languages, Arabic also gave a number of loan words to Muslims. In fact, the transfer is much greater in the Muslim world between Arabic, classical Quranic Arabic, and the Muslim languages. There is hardly a Muslim language that has not been affected in a serious way by the Quranic Arabic. Because if they don't have the concept, they just take the concept from the Quran and make it part of their mental furniture. You see what I'm saying? And the same thing applies to the words that were brought into these languages. And this is very evident in India as in Africa and in Iran. The other point that needs to be emphasized with regard to this cultural, theological interaction between the Muslims coming from Arabia and the Muslims in the subcontinent is the fact that Islamic learning developed. It took off to the point that today, one of the major centers of learning of Islam today is in India. I mean, you go to Hyderabad, I mentioned Lucknow, Mansouriya, and all those places. These have been historically major centers of scholarship. You have thousands, hundreds of thousands of books on Islam written by people from that part of the world, to the point that you can be born in an Urdu culture and be well grounded in Islamic thought without really speaking Arabic. But you will know a large number of Quranic because it's now imbibed, what the linguists will call imbibiation. You imbibe these concepts and words in your language. And this is precisely what has happened in the West. There are many Westerners today who can tell you about Plato, they don't know Greek. You see what I'm saying? Because of this knowledge transfer that came. The same thing happened with Arabic. Arabic was imbibed by an elite group. And today, if you go to in northern India, there are northern Indians who speak Arabic as well, maybe if not better than many Arabs. I'm talking about classical Arabic. So because of the long tradition of studying Fusha and going into the madrasa and learning that language. Now, that is not the way everybody in the society who is Muslim is in that category. But you do have these elite groups and families that go into many centuries who have been specializing in Quranic studies, and they become Hafiz al-Quran, they become Muhadithuns, and they can do tafsir, mufassiruns, and they become experts in kalam and all kinds of Islamic discipline. So this is one of the interesting things with regard to what Islam brought about, to the point that you have a number of these various ethnic groups that you find in India today who are part of this global Islamic Commonwealth. Of course, we can spend a lot of time, but I have to move on to the other areas to really talk about the expansion of Islam. Now, as Islam moved from Iraq, as I said, after the Battle of Qadisiyah and Muslim armies took over the Persian world, Islam now began to move into Central Asia, to the point that groups we now call Tajiks, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Turkish groups, these groups were now beginning to be exposed, to the point that they, like the Indians and the Africans, were now imbibing Islamic knowledge. I don't think many Muslims, especially Arabs, have not thought about this, that it was a Muslim from Bukhara who collected the most powerful set of hadiths. Why not an Arab from Mecca, from Medina, from Iraq, from Syria? It was someone from Bukhari. You see what I'm saying? Who collected the hadith. You see what I'm saying? But someone who is familiar with Jewish thought will tell you, how come now you have American Jews are experts? The leading scholars of Judaism are not in Israel, they're in America here. So the same thing happened with civilizations, that you will have sometimes the masters of the knowledge are not the homeboys. There's somebody out there. You see what I'm saying? Some people from other areas. And this is precisely what happened in Islamic history, that you now have people in Central Asia, in Bukhara, among the Uyghurs, the Kyrgyz, the Turkmens, the Kazakhs. All these different groups in Central Asia were gradually exposed to Islam. And Islam began, just like I was saying, in Africa and in India, you begin to see cities that existed in these areas were gradually Islamized, or new cities were created by Muslims. Tashkent becomes a major center of learning. Bukhara became a major center of learning. And of course, you go into the Uyghur area, part of which are now very much controlled by the Chinese. You now begin to see Islam moving into that part of the eastern portion of Central Asia. And this is how Islam came into China. Now, scholars disagree among themselves as to when Islam came into China. Some scholars would say that definitely by 850, Islam was in China during the Tang dynasty. Now, the Muslims went to China just like they went to India or Africa. You either go overland or you go by sea. That's why you have two patterns of penetration of Islam in China from Central Asia. And this is where the linkage between Central Asians and Chinese Islam very closely connected. Of course, the creation of the Soviet and before that the Tsarist empires interfere with that Islamic history, because many of the people who now live in Central Asia, the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks and others, were either part of the Qajar, Persian speaking, or they were part of the Ottoman empires 500, 700, 800 years ago, if you go back in terms of history. Now, what has happened really here is that the Muslims who found themselves in China came in search of silk. Just like Marco Polo was looking for opportunities, is Italian, the Polo family from Italy, trying to find business opportunities in China. The Silk Road, which existed even in Roman times, would be inherited by the Arab Muslims, and the Muslims who will take over from the Romans as the dominant power in world history would monopolize the silk trade to China. And of course, many of those Arabs and Persians settle in China, in the western part of China. And that is how the Uyghurs and the Kyrgyz, the Kazakhs and others groups would be exposed to Islam. Now, the Tang dynasty would be replaced by the Song dynasty. And the Song-Tang dynasty would be very instrumental in the spread of Islam, because what happened is, even though these, just like in Africa, you had those Arab trading families that came and settled, but they were treated as barbarians by the Chinese. The Han Chinese saw them as barbarians. These are barbarians. They did the same thing to the Jews who were there before the Muslims. And they did the same thing to the Nestorian Christians who were missionaries in that part of China, the Xinjiang province area. Now, what is very interesting here is that as these Muslim traders came through the silk trade and establishing themselves in the western part, northwestern part of China, Islam spread just like it did in Africa and India. You begin to see some of those groups becoming Muslims. Now, the Muslim traders who came by way of the sea with their boats, passing through Indonesia, Malaysia, and going to China, those Muslims settled in Gansu, like in the southern part of China. And these Muslims established settlements in those areas. And of course, today, if you go to Gansu, you'll find that in some of those cities, Muslim settlements that have tombs of Muslims with Arabic, Persian, Chinese inscriptions. And that's how scholars have been able to reconstruct the history of the Muslims in that part of the world. Now, so you have these two networks. You have the spice route leading through the islands, Malaysia, Indonesia, going up to China, and then you have the Silk Route. Now, what is very interesting is that if you look at the geography of religion in China, the Muslims are the largest religious minority in China. In the past and in the present, there was a small Jewish presence. And many of those Jews who lost their numbers in China among the Hui Chinese became Muslim Huis. So they become Muslims. Because their numbers were getting smaller, they joined the Muslim minority group because they were seen by the Chinese as barbarians. All these non-Chinese were barbarians. Now, the Hui Chinese are the offsprings of Han Chinese who intermarry with other groups. There are other Muslims who were not Chinese, they were Turkish, Muslim of Turkish background. The Uyghurs, the Kazakhs. Now, these were conquered. There were some Iranians who were brought as slaves into China. And of course, this was before Islam. And many of those people would be instrumental because they passed some of the knowledge, decorative art knowledge that you find in China. And many of those Chinese brought the Central Asians into the area. So when you have the Ming dynasty and the Manchu dynasty, those Chinese who were ruling, these Ming and the Manchu dynasties were considered barbarians by the Chinese because they were not Han Chinese. Now many of us don't appreciate, we see a Chinese is a Chinese, but they are different. They are different. Just like in Africa, you see one African, don't think that all Africans are like him. I mean, you have Africans, you have Africans, you have Africans. So they're different. The same thing with the Chinese. But the Chinese, the Han Chinese, they knew themselves. They knew that, and they could differentiate between themselves and the other groups that existed. Now, what is very interesting for us as students of Muslim Islamic history in China is that as a result of the coming to power of the Ming dynasty and the Manchu dynasty, those Muslims among the Han Chinese, or those Muslims who were the offspring of Han marriages with non-Han, among the Turkish-speaking people, were now used cleverly by the Chinese ruling group as border guards. They used them at the border. Why is that? Because these Hui Chinese, who were mixed Chinese and Turkish, could be more effective at the border in dealing with their cousins who are Turkish than the full-blooded Han Chinese. And this would lead to the scattering of the Muslims. And of course, the Muslims have this concept of the Murabitun, those who were the border guards in Islamic history. So, I mean, like the Murabitun, so those who are the defenders of the Ribat. Now, the interesting thing here really is that these Muslim Hui Chinese who were used as bodyguards were scattered by these varying dynasties in the border. And this will account for the dispersal of Muslims throughout China. Another way in which Muslims came into China in big ways was that many of those Central Asian Turkish groups were recruited by the ruling dynasties, especially the Mongols. Once the Mongols took over China, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, remember they ran into China and wiped out the dynasties there and created their own dynasty. And then, of course, they destroyed Baghdad in 1258. And of course, that affected the history of Muslims for the last 700 years. Now, in the Chinese context, the Mongol invasion of China resulted in the planting of more Muslims. That's the irony. They destroyed Baghdad and they wiped Muslim power. But in order for these Mongols to rule the Chinese, the Han Chinese, they needed Muslim collaborators. So the British did the same thing, like in other parts of the world. Empire builders had this strategy. You use collaborators to help you control the area. And Muslims were used by the Mongols to help in the running of their newly established empire. And those Muslims from Central Asia found themselves as advisors. Some of them were ministers within this Mongol ruling dynasty. The same thing applies with some of the Nestorian Christians who were also brought in by these Chinese ruling groups. And of course, this would lead to the development of major centers among these Chinese groups. And of course, that's why you have places like Huangsu, which was a prominent Muslim town during the Tang and Song dynasties. You have Nanjing, for example. It's another cosmopolitan. In fact, some scholars would say it is the first capital city of the Ming Taisu dynasty. And the Muslims were very much placed in that area. And of course, it was this group that resettled many of the Muslims into the frontier areas. And they have the Xinjiang area of the south and west of the Taklamakan, desert in China. And of course, those Muslims also found themselves in that area. The city of Kashgar, or Kazi to Chinese, is the most important city for the Uyghurs, in China, because that city itself was named after one of their heroes who resisted Chinese influence. And of course, one of the sheikh of these Chinese Muslims who became a wife of one of the Chinese emperors came out of this town of Kashgar for the Chinese. Now, what is very interesting is that just like in India and in Africa, you also have this. Well, it is happening even in American civilization. We have Chinatown, we have Spanish Town in America today. Isn't that true? So you have this same pattern of distribution. It was not only done by the Arabs. The Romans did the same thing. They have their garrisons. you see. And so in the case of China, the pattern of residence was very much affected by the religion. So when the Muslims went to these towns I just mentioned, like Kashgar and other areas, the Muslims made sure that they maintain their side of town. And of course, in their side of town, they'll have the Jami Masjid at the center. Now, in the case of the Chinese, they have 4 different kinds of mosque. They have what they call the Eid Mosque, which was reserved exclusively for Eid prayers. So when they have Eid prayers, like the Eid al-Adha or Eid al-Fitr, they will go to that place. That's where they worship. And they have a Chinese name for it. Then they have the mosque for Juma prayer, reserved exclusively for Juma prayer. So Juma prayer, that's the place where they go for Juma prayer. But then they have mosque close to the tomb of their saints. And then they have musallas on the highway and in the mountains where they will pray. So these were the different types of places of worship in China. Now, if you look at the Chinese Muslims, just like in India and in Africa, you also have the divide between the orthodoxy, very literal interpretation of the religion, and the Sufi who were leaning on towards tasawwuf. You have the same phenomena. Now, those people who were seen as very Hanafi, because Chinese are basically Hanafis, Chinese Muslims are Hanafis. These Hanafis, they call them Khadimu. You know, like they take the Arabic word al-Khadim and they call them Khadimu in Chinese. So, I mean, you know, like those Chinese who came out of that background, of course, have this very orthodox Hanafi position vis-a-vis the Tasawwuf groups. And the Tasawwuf groups are divided into 4 major groups. You have the Kubriya, and you also have the Jafriya, and then you also have the Khadriya. Now, these different groups of Sufi orders among the Chinese are very much linked to Central Asia and to Yemen and the other Muslim groups. Now, these Muslims who found themselves in China also have different dietary restrictions, whereas in India, the Muslims who came out of Hindu background made that theological somersault by taking the position that, okay, you guys don't eat meat, we eat meat, so long as it's halal. Whereas for the Hindu, they will not eat meat. So you can now see the need for halal shops. One thing that is very interesting in Southeast Asia, more so than anywhere else in the Muslim world, is that they are particularly concerned about access to halal food. So in the case of in China, the Hui Chinese, who are half Han Chinese and Turkish, dominate butchery because they are in livestock. Now, if you go to Southeast Asia, places like Thailand, Malaysia, Burma, the Pushtun people, the Pushto people from northwestern province of Pakistan and India, they dominate butchery in Southeast Asia. That's why if you go to places like Thailand, in Burma, you find many of those people who came to that region, and in Malaysia by virtue of the British expansion, make sure that they have halal food. If you go to Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, and all those areas, you will see halal food. The Chinese do the same thing. And one way of distinguishing themselves from other eateries controlled by Chinese, they will have La ilaha illallah, they will have Muhammad, Rasulullah, or Allah. So even if you don't know Chinese, you recognize Allah. Even the illiterate Muslim knows what Allah is, because they see that in their masjid all the time. They see the crescent. So in China, if you go to the major Chinese cities like Beijing, where you have 40 mosques, in Beijing alone you have 40 mosques, you will find eateries where you will have halal food. In Shanghai province and in Gansu provinces, where you have many mosques, you will have many eatery places where you can get meat, halal meat. You also have what they call saykhana, tea houses, where you will get this. Now, even though the number of Chinese who are Shiite is very negligible, Shiite influence among Chinese Muslims comes through the Farsi language. And you can see this early influence of Farsi-speaking people in Chinese Islam in the way they call their leaders. They don't call the Sufi leaders Sheikh, they call them Hoja. You see, and you can see in China the fact that among the Chinese, many of those Sufi Chinese, just like in West Africa, they identify themselves with the Shiite heroes like Hussein and Ali. So you may have a Hanafi, Sunni Chinese Muslim, who will still trace his Qadiriya or Naqshbandi Sufi lineage back to Ali or Fatima. That is very interesting phenomena with regard to the Chinese. And this is likely because of the Iranian influence among the Chinese at an early period in the history of Islam in China. Now, Islam in China, of course, is very much linked to Islam in Indonesia, Islam in India, Islam in Vietnam, because people from India had always established contact with Central Asia. And through Central Asia, Indian Muslims still go into China, what we now call Pakistan, serve as the entry point, to the point that even modern travelers from the West who have visited China have observed people coming from Pakistan selling Qur'ans to Chinese. And this shows you that even with communist rule, Muslims have been able to get into the area. Now this leads us to the relationship between the Muslims and the Chinese authorities, pre-revolutionary, post-revolutionary. In pre-revolutionary China, as I told you, from the Tang dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Qing dynasty, coming all the way up to the end of the last dynasty before the revolution of Sun Yat-sen in China, the relationship was dicey, very difficult between Chinese and authorities and the Muslims. Those Muslims who are Uyghurs were found to be very rebellious, and of course Khazgar in Chinese history is the symbol of Muslim defiance to Chinese rule. And of course the Khazgari Muslims are always resistant, and you had in the late 1900s, some scholars, people like T.B. Irving and others, who is a Muslim of Canadian descent, who would argue that the British instigated them to revolt against the Chinese authorities. But the point to be made here is that the Muslims were able to resist the Chinese authorities, and of course there were massacres in the history of Chinese Islam. Now, in most instances, of course, they had a modus vivendi. And as I told you, those Muslims of Chinese descent were able to work out a deal with their cousins because they needed them to be border guards or administrators in some parts of the... And then, of course, the Muslims from Central Asia who were of Turkish origin, whenever found useful, were used by the Chinese authorities regardless of dynasty. Now, the Muslims in China were able to build mosques, they were able to have their halal food, their tea houses, and their madrasas. And of course, by the time the communists came, there were at least 6,000 masajids, mosques in China. And Muslims number up to about 60 million in China. Now, of course, since the communists came to power, most of those mosques were demolished or used for other purposes by the Chinese government. Now, the latest text that came out of that addressed the whole question of Muslims in China, came in the late 1990s, suggests that the Muslim population has survived, and some new developments that have taken place in China. One is, since the Arab oil boom in the 70s, the Chinese have mellowed a little bit, and they have allowed Muslims to reopen and rebuild their mosques. In some cases, they have even built new mosques with patronage from Saudi Arabia or from the Muslim world. For example, at the Chinese Islamic Academy in Xinjiang was able to build a very nice structure thanks to the generosity of the Islamic Development Bank. And so you now have in China a number of young Chinese who are now studying to become imams, something that was a no-no in China. And of course, Chinese would like to have businesses with Pakistanis and Muslims from the Middle East and elsewhere in Darul Islam. So for that reason, the Chinese have allowed the creation of the Chinese Islamic Association, to the point that this Chinese Islamic Association create some kind of relationships with Muslim countries. And of course, the number of Muslims who go for pilgrimage to from China has also increased over the years. So this is something that makes it possible for Indian Muslims from the subcontinent, or Pakistanis or Bangladeshis, to meet Chinese at the Hajj, just like Africans would meet these other Muslims from elsewhere in the world. Now, this leads me to the Muslims of Southeast Asia, Muslims of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma. Now, the same pattern of penetration we described in China took place in Indonesia. Of course, there was no overland because you have to travel over water to get into those Indonesian and Malaysian region of the world. So the Arabs who came were mainly from Yemen and Syria. Now, those Arabs who came and settled, and today you still find in Aceh, in Indonesia, people who claim to be of Arab descent. From their names are different from the other Indonesians. They have pure Arab names. Hussein Alatas, Ibrahim Alatas, or Ibrahim Ahmad, Farooq Ahmad, just like Pakistanis and Indian Muslims who have Hassan, Abdullah. You'll find in Indonesia and Malaysia people who claim to be of Arab descent. I mentioned Anwar Ibrahim as an example, who is of Arab South Asian descent. I mean, you have many people like that. Even Mahathir is supposed to be from that kind of background, the president and the present prime minister of Malaysia. Now, one of the reasons why you have these people in Aceh, in Indonesia, who would like to break away from Indonesia, just like the East Timorese, is because of this whole background. Because they feel that the other Indonesians are not really, quote unquote, good Muslims. Because in Indonesia, you have two terms by which the Indonesian Muslims define themselves. You have the Santri and the Abangan. The Santri are those Muslims who are very Hanafi, strict Muslim type, or Safai, strict Muslim type. No nonsense. Islam is Islam. No any cultural baggage that you bring into it. No, Islam is Islam. We are Hanafi, we go this way. So, I mean, you have that kind of position. Or we are Safai, we go this way. Now, the Abangan are very much like many of these African groups who have embraced Islam, but they have really still retained some of the old culture. And of course, those are the Abangan. like the Abangan among the Indonesian Muslims. Now, if you look at Indonesia, it's a country of thousands of islands. Java is the largest, and they have the bulk of the population. You have Sumatra, you have Aceh. So if you are talking about the centers of Islam, really, you're talking about Javanese Islam, quote unquote, Sumatran Islam, quote unquote, Aceh Islam, and of course there are Islamic forces in the other small islands that exist. Now, what is very interesting is that with the coming of the Arab traders in Indonesia, Islam gradually established itself in the ports of those areas. And Islam had to compete, just like in India, with civilizations and cultures that had already planted themselves. Because if you look at Indonesia, it's one of the richest places in the world with regard to the mixing of cultures. You have Chinese, you have Indian, and of course you have Arabic Islamic, whether it's Islamic of a mixed bag. You see what I'm saying? From India, from the Arab world, etc. That is what Indonesia is about. And this has affected the history of Islam in Indonesia. To the point that today, if you look at Indonesia, you have many of these Quranic schools, just like in Africa, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and elsewhere, you have Muslims. So the Indonesian Muslims, they study Arabic, and it's amazing. You go to Jogja, I don't know whether some of you have been to Indonesia, but if you go to Jogja, one thing that is Yogyakarta, which is a very interesting center of Islam in Indonesia, I mean, you go to these stores, you have all kinds of hijab dress, fancy ones, especially when the economy was doing well in Indonesia. It's amazing. I mean, it's like you're going to Madison Avenue and you have all kinds of shops among the Indonesians and all kinds of hijabs. And you have all kinds of video cassettes and tapes of Islam in that part of the world in Indonesia. And of course, this shows the planting of Islam in that part of the world. And of course, if you go to Aceh, you have the same kind of situation, and in Sumatra, because of the history of Islam. But, as I said to you, those Indonesians who are still considered easygoing Muslims, the Abangan, are the majority. And of course, the Aceh Muslims would like to see a different story in Indonesia, just like in the Middle East, and in Pakistan and in India, you have various groups that would like to see purer and more vigorous Islam in these societies. Now, Malaysia, just across the waters, has the same ethnic history as the Indonesians. They speak a language that is very closely related to each other. And of course, these Malay people were equally exposed to Islam by the Arab traders who came in. Not all of them were Arabs, some of them were Iranians, and some of them were Indians from India. So these three groups, Indian, Arab, Persian, Muslims coming into that region, gradually planted themselves in that area. And the various kingdoms that you find in the entity we call Malaysia today owe their roots to the coming of Islam 500-600 years ago. And today, if you go to Malaysia, you will see that the Islamic presence is very significant, not only in terms of national Muslim organizations, and this is very evident when you go for Hajj, because I think the Malaysians have organized the best network for the handling of the Hajj among the Muslims. And of course, this is an interesting phenomena in terms of Indonesia. The other thing is, the Malaysian Muslims have imbibed Islam, and not only in terms of theology and concepts, etc., and rituals, but they have also modified the Arabic script to their own devices. Now, of course, one thing that has happened in Malaysia, which did not happen in India, and it also happened in Africa. So the Malaysian experience and the African experience are similar in the sense that both in Malaysia and in Africa, the Arabic script would be replaced by the Roman script under colonial rule. To the point that today in Malaysia, Malaysians write in the Roman alphabet. This did not happen with the Urdu-speaking Muslims. It happened with the Turks. In the case of the Chinese Muslims, one way of dividing the Turkish-speaking people in Central Asia is to split them between those who write with Roman letters, the Chinese allow that, and those who use Cyrillic or Arabic script. So in this case, you administer what I call the Ataturk pill of historical amnesia, because you cut the people off from their heritage the moment you change the alphabet. Can you imagine what will happen to us here in the United States if all of a sudden we all write in Japanese script? You will not read Jefferson anymore. Because because you're cut off from him. You can't read English Roman alphabet. You now use Japanese characters. That's what happened to some of the Muslims. So that's one of the reasons why many people don't understand why some of the Muslims are worked up in terms of system challenging. Because I don't think Westerners have ever gone through that kind of experience in terms of being administered the pill of historical amnesia. You forget your past because we change the letters on you. And this is precisely what happened in Central Asia. It also happened in Malaysia. Of course, it was done by the British in the case of Malaysia, to the point that today, if you go to Malaysia, if you read the newspapers, you read them either in English or you read them in Malay using Roman characters. Whereas if you go to Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, or Libya, you still read the newspapers with Arabic script. You see what I'm saying? Now, you go to Pakistan, India, the Urdu newspapers are still using the Arabic script with modification. See, these are the important developments that must be taken into account. This was something the Poles were resisting from these Russians, because you want to change the Cyrillic to replace the Roman letters. So, that affects your mentality, your consciousness. The Poles don't like it. The Hungarians don't like it. So, this becomes very important. These are issues we don't want to talk about when we look at history and civilization, because they're not very good kind of thing. This is something that happens in history. Now, to go back to Malaysia, what I would say is that the Malay-speaking people have their cousins in Thailand, in Pattani. In 1902, the people living in Pattani found themselves on the wrong side of the border. This was likely because of the deal between the British and the ruling king of Siam. Now they call themselves Thailand. Now the king of Siam took over Pattani and all the provinces and districts in that area, and the towns. Hat Yai, it's a major Muslim city. Songkhla, major Muslim city. Now, all those areas had Islamic culture and civilization the way we describe in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in India, in Africa, and the Middle East. But what has happened is, since 1902, there has been a gradual and systematic Thaization or Siamization of the Javi-speaking people, to the point that many of the Pondok, this is the Javi Malay term for Quranic schools, the Pondok. Now, you begin to see that the Pondok was gradually taken over by these by these Thais, to the point that the Thai government began to encourage the creation of Islamic schools that were under the control of the Ministry of Education in Thailand. And of course, many of those Muslims were now subjected to the program of Thaization. And of course, the Patani Liberation Movement, which fought against Haji Yusuf, who led this struggle against against the Thais was killed. And then, of course, some of his followers went to the bush and they started fighting against the Thai government. Now there is some kind of modus vivendi, to the point that today the foreign minister of Thailand came from that part of Thailand, Surin. And he is a Harvard graduate. And of course, he speaks Thai just like the other Thais. So he is part of that compromise between the Muslim ruling groups in southern Thailand and the Thai leadership in Bangkok. Now, this was not the case for the Muslims in Vietnam. Earlier on, we talked about, in the lecture on Islam in America, I talked about how before World War II, there were less than 100 Vietnamese in America. Today, there are over 1 million Vietnamese in the United States. Some of those Vietnamese came from Champa, Vietnam. These are the Champa Muslims. Champa is one of the kingdoms in Vietnam which was controlled by the Muslim Vietnamese. And of course, they have a history which is very similar to the history of the other Muslims in Southeast Asia. These are either the children of Arab or Persians, or they were converted by Muslim Sufis and Muslim traders. In fact, over 90% of them were the converts to Islam at the hands of Sufi masters and Arab Persian traders. In fact, if you go to Bangkok, there is a section of that place which was the settlement of the Iranians who lived there. Of course, today, the descendants, the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of those Iranians are indistinguishable from the other Thais. Some of them may not even know that they have Iranian ancestry because of their assimilation into the Thai population. The same thing happened in Vietnam. Those Champa Muslims had the same kind of relationship with the Vietnamese ruling dynasties that the Hui Chinese Muslims had with the Chinese dynasties. And of course, in their case, they were very much persecuted. And when the French came, they survived for a while. And of course, when the communists came, they suffered terribly. Some of them collaborated with the Americans. That's why they're here. If you go to Texas, you go to Northern Virginia, you go to California, you have these Vietnamese Muslims from Champa. And of course, they've lost their kingdom. In the post-Vietnam situation, of course, the Champa Muslims are reduced to very insignificant minority if they have not been killed or sent into exile. The same thing with the Muslims in Cambodia. The Khmer Muslims are also the children of Muslim traders. Muslim traders and Sufis going into Southeast Asia and establishing contact with the Cambodians. Here you have a Buddhist culture that came out of India and Sri Lanka, now coexisting with Islam. And those Cambodian Muslims found themselves in that kind of situation. Now, the Cambodian Muslims are very small compared to the Muslims you have in Vietnam. But they are part of that reality in Cambodia. And today, even today, as we speak, there are Muslim Cambodians. And they have their own halal stores, just like I pointed out to you in Singapore, in Thailand, in Burma, where you have Muslim minorities. The Muslims are very concerned about halal food. And they make sure that while maintaining their masajids, they also have places where they can eat halal food. This is true in Cambodia and Vietnam as in Thailand and Burma. The Burmese Muslims, of course, mainly came out of Bangladesh, what we now call Bangladesh, because they can come across. And they came with the British. There were a small minority of Muslims who predated the British presence in Burma, what is called Myanmar today. Now, the final point I want to make with regard to Islam in this part of the world is that if you look at Islam in Southeast Asia, you will see that the most advanced in terms of modern knowledge today are the Muslims in Southeast Asia. They have newly industrialized countries. They are now identified as part of the newly industrialized countries. Malaysia is now an industrial country. It's a Muslim country that is industrialized, and and it belongs to the ASEAN nations, and is considered one of the newly industrialized countries. Indonesia belonged to that league, but the Indonesians could easily slip back, and they are recovering from this recent financial crisis. But they were on the path towards industrialization and were considered by many scholars as newly industrialized countries. So in this case, the Malay and the Indonesian Muslims are ahead of the other Muslims. Now, the Muslims in South Asia have large number of highly modern people, but in the case of the Indian Muslims, they don't control the state. In the case of Pakistan, they control the state to the point that they have a nuclear weapon, which is a modern instrument of self-defense. But the societies have not been transformed into industrial society. So in a case, Pakistan is very much like Russia. You have an almost industrialized country, but it has a large population that is pre-industrial. And this is true of Russia as in the case of Pakistan. Maybe the numbers are more in favor of Russia than Pakistan, but that is the reality. The only instrument of modernity they have is the nuclear weapon, you see, which to some extent include them into the category of modern do-or-die leadership. But when it comes to industrialization, producing industrial gadgets the way Americans do, or British do, or French do, or Japanese do, they haven't reached that level of mass consumption through mass industrialization of the society. Now, in the Arab world, the most industrialized Arab country was Iraq. And of course, the Iraqis have been blown out of existence, likely through our effort, the United States. So, so the Iraqis were the more advanced Arabs in terms of industrialization. They were certainly going the way of Indonesia and Malaysia. And I think the Iraqis, if they did not have a leader like Saddam Hussein, they would have made it in terms of being an industrial country in the Middle East. And maybe the Syrians will catch up and the Egyptians with their population reduced will follow, and the others, but it didn't happen. So this is the situation you have in terms of Southeast Asia. So when you look at Southeast Asia, they are in the forefront of industrialization in the Muslim world. But they are also in such capital when it comes to some other areas in terms of Islamic knowledge, because the centers of Islamic knowledge are still in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq in terms of the Middle East. And of course, in terms of the South Asia, you have Pakistan and India, you still have major centers of Islamic learning. And then of course you come to Africa, you have Egypt going all the way to Morocco, and then you have pockets in sub-Saharan Africa, as I described to you. The other point that I want to make here with regard to Islam in Southeast Asia is that in Southeast Asia, the Muslims face people whom they did not fight against, whereas in other areas, the Muslims faced people they lorded over. And because of the changing circumstances, the Muslims are going through the same problem that the Russians are going through now. That's why I tell Russians or people who have Russian descent I met in the United States that the Russians are the people who are going through the same kind of have-been syndrome that the Muslims are going on for centuries. Because you see, the Russians used to dominate all those Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and all those places, Armenia, but now they don't have that. So the influence and prestige they used to have, they don't have. Very much like the Muslims. Now, this becomes very important if you compare and contrast Southeast Asian Muslims and the other Muslims. Unlike the Indian Muslims who used to run the Mughal Empire and they are lord over the Indian Hindus, and Sikhs until the British dislodged Muslim hegemony in India. And unlike many of the other Muslims in Africa who were dominant, like in the Sokoto Caliphate or the various Islamic kingdoms that were established in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, the Muslims did not rule others, except in Indonesia and Malaysia. But they found themselves in a region where they were a minority. So in Southeast Asia, what you find is that the Muslims in China, in Thailand, in Vietnam, they were living with people they did not fight against. In the Middle East, the Muslims had to deal with the Christians and the Jews. In Africa, they had to deal with those people who were traditionalists, polytheists. And in India, they had to deal with the Hindus. Whereas in the case of Southeast Asia, the Muslims did not have a fight with the Buddhists. If there is any kind of struggle with the Buddhists, that's a recent development in the history of the region. And this is what happened with civilizations. Civilizations that were dominant, once they lose power, they become pariah groups. And of course, the Muslims, to understand the tension that is happening globally and the role and place of the Southeast Asians in that tension, you have to understand the history of dominance. Muslims who were dominant before and are now sidelined and marginalized will be more angry. And chances are they'll be more willing to fight than Southeast Asian Muslims. You don't hear most of the tension that you hear in other parts of the Muslim world in Southeast Asia. They didn't have that history of dominance. You see, and this is precisely what you have. And I think this is a lesson for Western people to learn in terms of world history as the Chinese come to power. Now, the reality is, when you look at the situation in the world system, you have to recognize the fact that in Southeast Asia, you are beginning to have a new reality there. And that new reality is that the Southeast Asian countries are coming to recognize that in order for them to join this power game, they have to work out a modus vivendi of the various religions they have there. They have Hindus, they have Christians, they have Muslims, and they have Sikhs, who are immigrants because they came out of India like the Muslims. All these groups that live in that area, and they're intellectuals, are very conscious of this. And people like former Prime Minister of Singapore, what's his name again? Lee Kuan Yew. People like Lee Kuan Yew, people like Chandra Muzaffar and all those other people who are in that part of that Southeast Asian cultural part are very conscious of these realities, and that in order for the Southeast Asians to be players in the new emerging global system, these religious groups must learn to live together. And of course, they try to develop an accommodating system of coexistence. Now, whether it will work is something to be seen. So I will conclude just by saying to you that in Southeast Asia, Islam is very much alive, and the Southeast Asian Muslims are very proud of the fact that they are part of this caravan of modernization. And in the case of Malaysia and Indonesia, they have developed newly industrialized systems. Now, whether they will maintain that in the coming years is something that the leadership of that part of the world, Muslim and non-Muslim, will have to decide. So the Buddhists in Thailand must learn to live together with Muslim Malay, and the Muslim Malay must learn to live with Christian Filipinos. So that is the kind of situation that you have in Southeast Asia. Philippine Christians living with Malay Muslims and Indonesians together with Buddhists out of Vietnam, Thailand, and other areas. Something which is very different from what you have in Western Europe, in Africa. The closest would be America. So Southeast Asians look to America and hope that Americans will look to them. I end here. Thank you. Now, any question? I guess maybe we ran over your time.
We have a few minutes, so if there's any questions.
Philippine. Yeah, Muslim in Philippine time. Okay. In Mindanao, the southern part of Philippines, you do have the Muslims in those provinces, the southern provinces of Philippines. Of course, ethnically and linguistically, they are Javi-speaking people. They are cousins to Indonesians and Malaysians, because that whole area is a band of Javi-related ethnic groups. Now, their history is not very different from the history of the Indonesians and the Malay. Arab boats coming into the area settle in that region. And of course, they establish the same kind of relationship there as was done in Indonesia and Malaysia. Now, of course, the Filipino Muslims established their own kingdoms, just like they did in Patani, in what is now called Thailand, and in various provinces of modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia. What is different for them is that when the Spaniards came into the area, they were able to dislodge the Muslims in the region, and of course, they gradually took over portions of that island or islands which were inhabited by people not exposed to Islam, because you have so many different languages and ethnic groups in Philippines, just like Africa. So the Filipino experience is very similar to the African experience, where you have portion of the landmass or islands captured by one civilization and remaining portion unexposed or resistant to the dominant civilization. And then a challenging civilization, in this case European Christianity, coming in the person of the Spaniard into the region. And of course you had Portuguese coming also earlier, and the Dutch later. And these Spaniards gradually constitute a challenge to the Muslim presence. So you have a rivalry between an older Islamic presence versus a recently established Catholic presence. So you have a Muslim-Christian rivalry and competition. Now, what is very interesting in the Philippines, of course, is the American factor. In the 19th century, one American president said that he had a dream, and God told him, go there and take over. So, you remember him, right? So, he sent American troops to go in there, and of course, it was part of the expansion of America into the Pacific. And that began the marriage between Filipinos and the United States. Today, among the Southeast Asian groups, Filipinos are the largest in America, and they dominate the nursing business. Many of the nurses in many American hospitals are of Filipino origin in this country. And of course, even in the Arab world, like in the Gulf, many of those nurses in their hospitals came from Philippines, and babysitters in those parts of the world. Now, because of the history, everything has a historical origin to it. Now, the Spanish-American influence in Philippines accounts for Filipinos having Spanish-sounding names. And it also accounts for the fact that they speak English as a language that integrates them. And of course, it also accounts for the privilege they got among all the Southeast Asian groups in the American society here. Now, the point I want to make is that the relationship between the Muslims and the ruling authorities in Philippines over the last 100 years has been very dicey because of the competition between the Christian churches on the one hand and the Muslim groups that are trying desperately to maintain Islam in that part of Philippines. And of course, you now have two major liberation groups, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Moro Liberation Front. Now, of course, the Moro Liberation Front has been the dominant and oldest Islamic liberation group that would like to dislodge the authority of the central government in the southern provinces of Philippines. But the Filipino government has learned the same lesson that the Thais, the Russians, and other groups have learned. And that is, you bring people from other areas into the Muslim areas. And hopefully, over a period of time, you will outnumber the original inhabitants. That's an old strategy. It was done in the past. It happens to the Jews. You know, when Nebuchadnezzar came, that's how the kingdom of Solomon, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, the children of Solomon, that's how they lost that kingdom. I mean, you know, like the Jews were taken out of the area by Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, they were taken into what we now call Babylon in history. Imperialists learn from each other. So, I mean, you know, like, so in the case of Philippines, this is precisely what happened. The Muslims in Mindanao and the other provinces in southern Philippines are now being replaced, or at least forced to share space with transplanted Filipinos from other parts of the country. Just like the Russians did to the Tatars and the Chechenian Muslims. They took them out of Tatar area or Tajikistan or in Chechnya, they took them to Siberia. And they bring Russian families into the area. They did not only do that to Muslims, they did that to non-Muslims. They did that to the Christians in Lithuania and Estonia. You bring large, that's why the Estonians, they're independent, but they're not independent, because you still have large number of Russians in their country. The same thing happening in Philippines. The other point to bear in mind, and this brings us to the area of terrorism, is that you have Saifuddin group. This is a radical extremist group. They see themselves as the sword of the religion. And of course, this group has been the one that recently rounded up foreign tourists in southern Philippines, and the government was negotiating with them for the release of those German, Australian, I don't think they were Americans, I don't know, but I know there were German tourists who were involved there and some Australians. But this group has been responsible for the recent incident in that part of the world. And this is part of the larger problem of the Philippines. The government negotiated a deal under Marcos. Actually, Marcos' wife, Elmira, I think that's her name. Melda Marcos was the one who led the delegation to Tripoli. This was Gaddafi's chance to get fame in '73 when they negotiated a deal, a peace, a ceasefire. But of course, it didn't last. And today, you have this Moro Islamic Liberation Group challenging the authority of the central government. And of course, the new president of Philippines is desperately trying to work out a deal. So that's the situation in Philippines. I stop here, and I hope you have something from this presentation. Thank you.